Tientsin, China, 1900. As bullets from Chinese soldiers pepper your position. The soldier next to you grunts and falls to the floor, clutching his shoulder. Calling for a medic, a montage of the numerous, futile assaults against the strong walls of Tientsin plays through your head. You are a Japanese soldier, and for 2 days you have waded through waist-deep swamps, clung to positions completely exposed to the lethal Chinese bullets, all the while being bitten alive by crowds of mosquitoes and roasted by the boiling sun. Now the Allies are trying to blow up the city's southern gate, but the Chinese troops keep managing to extinguish the fuse. If something doesn't start going right soon, the army will have to retreat. Then you notice your friend, the engineer Hideki, tying a white rag around his head. With a start, you realize what he's going to do. He smiles at you, seemingly sad and stoic at the same time. Then, shouting, "Banzai!" he charges across the open terrain towards the gates, bullets whizzing and ricocheting around him. But, through some miracle, he is unhurt. Finally reaching the southern gate, he disappears from sight. Then a huge explosion deafens and blinds you. When the smoke finally clears, there is a breach in the gates. Your officer raises his samurai sword and barks out, "For the Emperor! For Hideki!" Charging towards the breach, the rising sun flag joined by the Union Jack and the stars and stripes, you assure Hideki's spirit that today is the day Tientsin will finally fall. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre Nazi.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Last episode, we saw how northern China, racked by economic dislocation, poverty and anti-foreigner sentiment, exploded into the Boxer Rebellion. Believing their martial art rituals made them invulnerable to bullets, their blood-soaked rampage through northern China left the foreigner communities in Beijing and Tientsin fighting for their lives, especially when the Chinese government threw in its lot with the Boxers and declared war on all the great powers. Now, the Western and Japanese empires were going to strike back, assembling a vast army to march on the very gates of Beijing itself. With the Taku forts captured, the great powers were able to ship in troops to form perhaps the strangest army in history. If you had walked through their camp, it would have been quite a sight. British officers sat beneath the Union Jack, alongside turbaned Sikhs from British India and knife-wielding Gurkhas from Nepal. North African Zouaves and Indo-Chinese tirailleurs downed their morning coffees under the tricolour, while Russian Cossacks mingled with elaborately uniformed Austro-Hungarians. Then there were the upstarts, Japan, whose European-style whites sparkled with global ambition, and Italy with their stylish black feather-plumed helmets, masking their recent failure at conquering Ethiopia. Most ostentatious were the Germans, in spiked leather helmets and Kaiser Wilhelm moustaches. Just to finish off the party, the US Marines had now arrived from the recently conquered Philippines. Their blue campaign coats and broad-brimmed felt hats, designed for fighting Native Americans on the Great Plains, making them look every inch the cowboys their new allies expected them to be. Befitting such a diverse army, all these nations had very different reasons to be part of this campaign. Officially, everyone was there to rescue the hostages. Unofficially, ambition, jealousy, and suspicion were far more prominent reasons. Japan was a very recent addition to the Great Power Club. For them, this was a coming-out party on the international stage to show off the success of their modernization drive. For the recently unified Germany, it was also a chance to stake a claim to be a world power, in line with its military and economic might. The excitable Kaiser Wilhelm II, the infamous Little Willie, even gave a fiery speech to his troops setting out for China. Quote, "If you come before the enemy, he will be defeated. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited. Just as 1,000 years ago, the Huns under their king Attila made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend. So may the name Germany be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever again dare to look cross-eyed at a German." End quote. As Little Willie's actions tended to do, this speech actually hurt Germany's reputation rather than embellishing it. Even at the time, contemporaries were shocked with its open call for war crimes, and it's why the Allies would call the Germans Huns in both world wars. Russia hungered for a warm water port in the east, and was looking at Manchuria like it was a tasty morsel, ready to be devoured. For Italy and Austro-Hungary, they were deeply unsure of their place among the great powers, and joining in was a way of proving they belonged to this elite club. Britain and France had vast commercial interests and spheres of influence to protect. America at first glance seemed the odd one out. It didn't have large interest in China at this time. However, the US was looking to change that. Already heavily involved in the opium trade alongside the UK, the vast narco profits making the fortunes of famous families such as the Astors, Forbes and Cabots, they were looking to stake a claim to the vast markets of China. Powerful Senator Henry Cabot Lodge openly said that, quote, "All Europe is seizing on China, and if we do not establish ourselves in the East, that vast trade from which we must draw our future prosperity, and that great region in which we alone can hope to find the new markets so essential to us, will be practically closed forever." End quote. I have gone into depth about the secret motives each power had to get involved in this campaign, as the competing national rivalries and ambitions are going to be a real problem. Everyone's all smiles for now, but they all have big knives behind their back. The leader of this multinational army of eventually 55,000 men was meant to be a German, Field Marshal Alfred von Waldersee, but he was still in Germany with the majority of his soldiers. With time of the essence, the command should have devolved to the next most senior officer, but this was the Japanese general Yamaguchi Motomi. White men, being commanded by an Asian? Perish the thought, bleated the other allies. Due solely to racism, the British Lieutenant General Sir Alfred Ghastly was made temporary commander instead. But just because he was in command didn't mean anyone would actually listen to him. The first order of business was to relieve the embattled Westerners and Japanese at Tientsin, with the Marines taking the lead. Among them was the soon-to-be famous Marine Smedley Butler, who is something of a patron saint of this podcast, appearing in multiple episodes so far. He just keeps popping up. Advancing on Tientsin by train, the Allies soon found out this wouldn't be an easy fight. The Marines blundered forward with no maps or intelligence about what they faced ahead. Rumours ran rampant. Some heard that Boxers had mined the train tracks, others that white women had been crucified by the hundreds. As this information vacuum filled with rumours, half-truths and outright lies, an 18-year-old Marine was so overcome with terror that he shot himself in the heart. Picking up some Russian troops along the way, they soon came across the human toll the siege was taking on the ordinary people of Tientsin. The river was literally filled with dead Chinese bodies, while packs of wild dogs fed on those that had washed ashore. They had tried to escape the upcoming battle, only to be robbed and killed by the Boxers. It's worth remembering the Boxers killed far more of their fellow Chinese than the foreigners they claimed to hate. Unnerved by the grisly sight, as they got within walking distance of the foreign concession, a volley of shells exploded in front of them. The Russian soldiers they were travelling with immediately retreated, leaving just 140 Marines to face 2,000 Chinese. Those poor Marines spent the next 4 hours retreating down the railroad track in a running gun battle with Chinese cavalry. Not helping morale, Butler recalled a salty older Marine explaining to the younger recruits that, quote, "A bullet that hits the skull sounds like a stone splashing into a pond." End quote. I bet he was fun at parties. After a bad start, the rest of the army finally arrived, and the Imperial troops pulled back to the Chinese part of Tientsin. Prepared for a scene of carnage and death, instead they found cheering Westerners and Japanese offering them tea and bottles of beer. The foreigners in Tientsin had been lucky to survive. The Imperial Army had fired 60,000 artillery shells with impressive accuracy at the foreign concession during the siege. However, most of the shells failed to explode on impact due to inefficiency and corruption in the Chinese ammunition factories. There was no time to rest, however. To get to Beijing, they first had to capture the Chinese part of Tientsin, and this was no easy task. 30,000 heavily armed defenders were dug in behind 20-foot stone walls. Against this, the Allies had just 6,000 troops. To even reach the city walls, the Allied troops would have to cross more than a mile of flat, unwooded terrain, dotted with farmhouses and swamps, and crossed by canals and causeways. An American soldier, surveying the scene later, said that, quote, "Had a formidable enemy defended the Chinese position, the attacking column would have been annihilated." End quote. The messiness of coalition warfare also didn't help. French had become the language of command, often bad French at that, leading to misunderstandings, while various nationalities refused to take orders from their rivals. The French wouldn't take orders from the Germans and vice versa, and let's not get into the Russians and the Japanese. In the early morning hours of July the 13th, the Battle of Tientsin began. The Americans, French and British and Japanese moved out to attack the southern gate of the walled city, while the Germans and Russians went around to the east. Coalition warfare proved an absolute mess. The US 9th Infantry was supposed to be on the left of the Allied attack, but due to a mix-up and a lack of clear orders, Colonel Liscombe led his men to the right by mistake. Restricted to only 180 rounds per man due to ammunition shortages, the Allies found themselves advancing across the obstacle-strewn open ground. Then all hell was let loose as they were raped by enemy fire. The Americans in their dark blue shirts and the Japanese in their white uniforms made excellent targets for the Chinese defenders, armed with modern rifles, helpfully sold to them by Western arms companies. The result was a bloodbath. You reflexively duck as the all-too-familiar sound of an incoming shell echoes in your ears. 2 Japanese soldiers, their white uniforms stained with mud, seemingly vanish in an explosion of red and yellow flame as it hits. A fellow American soldier staggers past, his feet sinking into the swampy ground, when suddenly he grabs his leg and cries out. As he falls to the floor, you try to help him, but as he screams, more Chinese bullets pound into his body, and he falls silent. Who planned this goddamn attack? There is no cover anywhere, and you're charging across open ground, sitting ducks for the Chinese snipers. Then your blood runs cold as another shell smashes into the ground next to you, splashing up mud. Diving to the floor, you wait for the explosion. But nothing happens. It's another dud. Thank God. The remaining Americans and Japanese are now clinging to the marshy ground, but still the relentless enemy bullets find their targets. The soldier carrying the stars and stripes rises from the floor and proudly waves the flag. You shout at him, "Get down, you fool!" But he just replies, "Old glory will never lie in the..." He doesn't finish the sentence as he clutches his chest, a red stain beginning to spread across the dark blue of his uniform. Colonel Liscombe rises and grabs the flag as the soldier slides to the floor, a look of shock on his face. Then you hear the colonel grunt, and his body seems to jerk. He sinks down to the ground, still clutching the flag. Crawling towards him, you can see he'd been badly hit, and is not long for this world. Grabbing your jacket, he looks up into your face and gasps out, "Keep up the fire!" Seemingly having used up the last of his strength, his arm becomes limp, and the life leaves his eyes. "We will, Colonel," you promised Liscombe's spirit, as you grab the flag and continue crawling towards Tientsin. This is really how Colonel Liscombe died. His famous last words are now the official motto of the 9th Infantry Regiment. With the assault quickly bogged down, only the onset of darkness allowed the Allies to finally retreat. The Marines were faring little better. They were meant to join up with the 9th Infantry and then support the Royal Welsh Fusiliers on the extreme left of the Allied line. However, thanks to their civilian guide, future President Herbert Hoover, things quickly went wrong. Initially impressed by his airy promises that he knew his way round the city walls like the back of his hand due to regular horse rides with his wife, the Marines soon discovered he was a better engineer than a guide. He accidentally led them to the wrong location. Of all places, a cemetery in the middle of a swamp. As Chinese bullets started pelting the Marines, they tried to dig shallow trenches in the marshy ground without success. As screams echoed out as man after man was hit, Butler sloshed through a mud patch to rescue a wounded Marine, until he felt a burning sensation in his right thigh. A bullet had blown a hole clean through the muscle. He crawled to a nearby grave mound for cover as his blood pooled in the watery mire. Before heading off to China, Butler had dreamed of getting shot, quote, "not too seriously, but sufficient to leave a scar," end quote. Be careful what you wish for. Luckily for Butler, he was rescued by a fellow Marine, but the rest of his comrades would be trapped in the rice paddies and graveyard till nightfall. As a Marine enlisted man later recalled, quote, "The bullets came like hail. I had the heel shot from my shoe and a hole through my hat. And that was the hardest 5 hours I think I've ever spent." End quote. As dusk fell, it had been a bloody day for the Allies, and they had taken heavy casualties. The whole Allied advance was stalled and might have been thrown back were it not for the daring of the Japanese. Early on the morning of July the 14th, Japanese sappers attached explosives to the south gate of Tientsin. They tried to light the fuse 3 times, but each time it was shot out by Chinese. Finally, as we saw in the opening dramatization, a Japanese engineer ran forward with a box of matches to set off the powder, blowing up himself and the gate. As Japanese and other Allied troops poured into the city, the Russians and Germans broke through the eastern gate, and Chinese resistance crumbled. The Imperial soldiers fled through 2 gates the Allies had left deliberately unguarded at the recommendation of the Japanese. The Allies had triumphed, but it had been a costly victory. Between the different nations, they had suffered 750 men killed and wounded, almost half of them Japanese. Chinese casualties are unknown, but included General Ni Xingyang, who had massacred the Boxers helping his force. His death is rather mysterious. It is alleged he was stabbed by pro-Boxer troops during the chaos of battle, and was then killed by an Allied shell. An over-the-top death worthy of a Bond villain. As the Chinese part of Tientsin fell, the Allied army got down to those traditional pastimes of imperial warfare: murder, rape and looting. The Germans and Russians were widely condemned as the worst offenders. Some of them would rape women and bayonet them afterwards. That said, no nation had clean hands. An American photographer entered the city the day after it fell and saw, quote, "a holocaust of human life. Bodies, young and old, littered the streets. The stench of rotting flesh wafted through the ruined buildings." End quote. The dead Chinese killed after the city's fall were all declared Boxer rebels to cover up the bloodshed. Ironically, by the time the Allies arrived at Tientsin, there were no more Boxers. Most had died charging the besieged foreign concession, or had been massacred by the Imperial troops. Those that were still alive had faded back into the countryside. The very movement that had started this war had collapsed. Now it was just a straight-up fight between the Imperial court and the West plus Japan. There were great fortunes to be made as the soldiers plundered Tientsin. British war correspondent Henry Savage Landor noted a breakdown along national lines in the objects of the looting. He thought that the Japanese were the only soldiers who showed, quote, "any natural and thorough appreciation of things artistic," end quote, whereas he was disappointed that the Western soldiers stuck to grabbing gold, silver and jewellery. Uncultured looting. That's the real crime here. The Americans got particularly lucky. The Marines were searching a burned-out official residence when they came across a huge load of silver bullion. Valued at $376,000 then, today it would be worth over $11 million. When the bars were sold to a representative of the bank J.P. Morgan, a few bars of silver mysteriously disappeared in transit. They were made into a silver punch bowl that was named after Colonel Liscombe. Officers of the Manchu Ninth still drink from the Liscombe Bowl in official ceremonies to this day, and it's worth a whopping $2.5 million. One foreign witness perfectly summed up this orgy of looting, rape and death. Quote, "A sweet lesson in Western civilization we are giving to the Chinese." End quote. With Tientsin in their hands, the Allies could prepare for an offensive to relieve the siege of the legations in Beijing. But were they already too late? The modern sensationalist press had truly come of age by 1900, and the Boxer Rebellion was the gift that kept on giving. After suitably breathless coverage of white Christians under siege for what the British Daily Mail described as, quote, "savage Oriental hordes," end quote, Suddenly, with cruel finality, all hope was snuffed out, and New Yorkers awoke to the following headline in William Randolph Hearst's New York Evening Journal, quote, "Europeans fight to the end, but are overwhelmed in legations. Men, women and children tortured before awful death. Read all about it." Over the next few days, they provided graphic details for readers. On July the 16th, the Evening Journal reported that, quote, "After killing their wives and children to prevent them from falling into the clutches of the frenzied Chinese, the foreigners in Peking were mowed down. The savages slew like beasts. Peking ran red with blood. History had a new horror at which generations will shudder. Not one of the 1,800 white men, women and children was left alive at Peking. Penned in within the narrow walls of legation buildings, the members of the diplomatic corps and their guards fought stubbornly and bravely the besiegement of the Boxers until at length their ammunition was exhausted. Huge gaps were made in the walls of their building, and the mutinous Chinese, with demonic yells, poured upon the gallant band. But death had come before torture. The last white had died fighting, and the blood-maddened Mongolians had to wreak their hellish ingenuity on the corpses." End quote. And you thought the media was sensationalist these days. A Chicago newspaperman compiled poorly sourced and second-hand accounts into that bestseller of the year 1900, Massacres of Christians by the Heathen Chinese and Horrors of the Boxers. Despite the rather clunky title, it was so popular that it sold out immediately and had free print runs. Even the infant medium of the newfangled motion picture industry got involved. A British filmmaker made a 4-minute movie called Attack on the China Mission, where evil Boxers killed a missionary and then prepared to ravage his wife and daughter before heroic British sailors came to the rescue. At its premiere, audiences demanded an immediate repeat viewing, and it became something of a sensation. Various other newspapers ran obituaries for the more notable figures killed in the legations, and a memorial service was even arranged at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. There was only one small problem. It was all a complete lie. The legations were still holding out. As the Evening Journal reported on July the 17th, without a trace of embarrassment, "Christians safe in Peking, read all about it." The story of the non-existent massacre had apparently been concocted by a shady American working as a special correspondent for the London's Daily Mail in Shanghai, far from the action in Beijing. Fun fact, even chocolate companies leapt on the Boxer bandwagon. You could buy boxes of chocolates which were covered with drawings of horrific Boxer atrocities, such as the murder of von Kettler, the ravaging of missionaries' wives, and the massacres of Chinese Christians. The past can be a strange place. While the media reported on this war with all the seriousness and subtlety of a bull in a china shop, the foreigners trapped in Beijing were in dire straits. Having failed to burn out the foreigners, an army of 160,000 imperial troops tightened the siege and began to relentlessly attack the Fu Palace, where the Chinese Christians had taken refuge. Leading the defences here was Lieutenant Colonel Goro Shiba, probably the most outstanding officer of the whole siege, along with his small Japanese force and a smattering of British and Italian reinforcements. Skillfully, he held off the Chinese attacks as they advanced behind walls built ever closer to the Japanese, threatening to surround them in a vice-like grip. Yet the sheer weight of Chinese attacks was slowly forcing him back. The Japanese defenders, would take almost 100% casualties during the siege. Such was the intensity of the fighting. The Imperial forces used such a mixture of ancient and modern weapons that the defenders never quite knew what they were going to be hit with. They could be pelted with arrows one minute, then the next, modern Krupp artillery shells would slam into their works. Some Imperials threw bricks and stones over the legation barricades. Others set off firecrackers for the psychological effect of ratcheting up the noise and tension during attacks. Among the Chinese weaponry were picturesque oversized muskets called jingles. Sometimes made as oversized copies of Western long arms, jingles could be more than 6 feet long. The weapons were so heavy that they had to be balanced on a stand or swivel and fired by a 2-man crew. Besieged Brit and compulsive diarist Nigel Oliphant wrote that in making his rounds on July the 2nd, he was, quote, much annoyed by a man who kept firing a jingle loaded with copper cash, basically small coins with square holes in the centre, and odd bits of metal onto the roof of the hospital. Although the explosion and the flash both seemed to be close to us, the man firing the jingle was really on the opposite side of the Mongol market, and thus 300 yards away. End quote. Perhaps the most vital area for the defenders were the German-American positions on top of the huge Tartar wall. If the top of the wall fell into Chinese hands, they would be perfectly positioned to fire directly into the legation quarter. If that happened, it was game over. The German barricades faced east on the Tartar wall, while the American positions faced west. It was a claustrophobic, uncomfortable and brutal existence for the defenders. The American commander, Captain John Myers, claimed that, quote, the men all feel they're in a trap and simply await execution. End quote. The Chinese relentlessly advanced, forcing the Germans off the wall, leaving the Americans as its sole defenders. Soon, the Imperial troops' barricades were literally a stone's throw from the Americans, and they began building a tower. If it was completed, they would finally be able to have a clear field of fire directly into the legation quarter, the nightmare scenario dreaded by the foreigners. Faced with this dire threat, the leader of the defence, Sir Claude MacDonald, decided there was no choice but to destroy the tower, already 15 feet tall and steadily looming over the legations. Myers planned a daring nighttime mission to destroy the tower and save the situation. At 3 a.m. on July the 3rd, a force of 23 British, 15 Russians, and 15 of his own men scrambled over the ramparts and snuck towards the Chinese lines. Dropping down the 10-foot-high barricade, you feel a jolt of pain surge through your knees as you hit the hard stone floor. Biting back a curse, you join the others in slowly, silently, making your way to the tower. It's a nerve-wracking experience, praying that a Chinese sentry doesn't spot your party until it is too late. The Russians, Yanks, and your fellow Brits melding together in the darkness until you can't tell them apart. You're close enough to hear the voices of some Chinese soldiers sitting by a fire, so far oblivious to your presence as you slip over their barricades. Captain Myers sneaks up on a sentry, one of his hands covering the man's mouth, the other plunging a knife into his throat. As you slowly prepare to attack, suddenly a Chinese soldier emerges from a tent next to you. For a moment, you just stare at each other before he screams out and tears the silence of the night asunder. You shoot him in the head, and he falls back into the tent. But now they know you're here. As the fighting goes hand to hand, you fight with the desperation of a man who knows it's kill or be killed. Slowly, the fight turns in your favor. Just as you are running through a Chinese soldier with your bayonet, you see another aiming his rifle at one of your comrades. The man's head snaps back, and he falls off the wall into the darkness below. A bellow of rage comes from a huge Russian who charges towards the Chinese soldier. Seemingly paralyzed by fear, the Imperial makes no attempt to defend himself, as the Russian lifts him up and throws him off the wall. His terrified scream echoes off the wall. Until you hear a dull thud. This finally breaks the morale of the Imperials, and they flee, leaving the tower to its fate. The tower was destroyed, and the Chinese were driven back more than 100 yards to their previous position. At least 20 Imperial soldiers were killed, at a cost of only 3 Allied dead. Sir Claude later praised this as, quote, one of the most successful operations of the siege, as it rendered our position on the wall, which had been precarious, comparatively strong, end quote. For the remainder of the siege, the Chinese did not attempt to regain or advance on their positions on the Tartar wall. Sadly, Myers stumbled onto a spear during the fighting and wounded his leg. Later, he contracted blood poisoning and had to sit out the rest of the siege. Charlton Heston portrayed a fictionalized version of him in the 1962 film 55 Days at Peking. It's quite good if you fancy it. Despite all the heroics, the death toll steadily increased. Nigel Oliphant's brother, David, was mortally wounded by an enemy sniper, while 3 days later, a shell killed the very unlucky Captain von Foreman. Originally in command of the defence of the Legations, he had been replaced on day 1 after a massive blunder. By an odd twist of fate, the Austrian captain had not originally been on military assignment. He had come to Beijing for a holiday and had been caught in the fighting when the rebellion broke out. Seeking to push the Chinese snipers even further back and build a new barricade 100 yards ahead of their current position, Myers' replacement, Captain Hall, and a private Dan Daly, crawled out to reconnoitre the area. They had expected that other Marines and Chinese Christians would then appear with sandbags to fortify the position, but none showed up. Hall decided to go back and get help. He told Daly, quote, I can't order you to stay here, but if the Chinese can be held back tonight, we can dig in so they'll never break through, end quote. Daly spat a stream of tobacco juice and laconically replied, quote, see you in the morning, Captain, end quote. Luckily for the Legations, Daly was just the man for the job. Originally joining the Marines to fight in the Spanish-American War, like so many volunteers, he never made it to Cuba and was shipped to Beijing instead. Soon to become a legend of the Marine Corps, he would later claim his time as a newsboy in New York prepared him perfectly for the soldiering life. Gives a whole new meaning to the term circulation wars. Daly was left alone behind a low stone parapet, clutching his rifle and a bandolier of ammunition. The Chinese attacked all through the night in groups of 1 or 2. Daly calmly picked them off, firing at the silhouettes framed by the flames leaping out of nearby houses. At dawn the next day, he was finally relieved by other Marines. He climbed down off the wall and asked his buddies, quote, anybody know what Quan Fei means? They were calling me that all night, end quote. Someone replied, it means devil. For his heroics, he would win the first of his 2 Medals of Honor. July the 1st would be the worst day of the siege for the harassed defenders. The Japanese and Italians had given up 3/4 of the Fu grounds to the enemy and were driven back to their last defensive line. As they endured a huge Chinese offensive, the besieged foreigners faced a new threat from underneath their feet. General Dong had brought in Chinese coal miners to dig under the legations, and then he exploded 2 huge mines under the French legation. 2 French sailors were killed in the blasts, which destroyed 2 buildings and some of the barricades. Arthur von Rosthorn, the Austrian ambassador, was trapped up to his waist in rubble from a collapsed roof and walls after the first blast. The second blast freed him by throwing him clear of the wreckage. Much of the French legation had to be abandoned, and the defensive line was pulled back to a trench the French had prepared as a fallback. Meanwhile, German forces repulsed a simultaneous Chinese offensive, killing a number of attackers in a bayonet charge across the legation's tennis courts. Despite the bravery of the defenders, this could have been the end. Luckily for them, a large number of Imperial troops had been too close to the site of the explosion and had also been killed, throwing the Chinese into confusion. They hadn't been warned by General Dong so as not to alert the foreigners. With leaders like that, who needs enemies? They had survived July the 1st, barely, but everywhere the defenders were being ground down, casualties mounted, dysentery swept the compound, and morale flagged. If the war of attrition continued, the defenders feared they would not last much longer. The more gloomy men talked of killing their wives and children should the Chinese burst through, in order to spare them. Polly Condit Smith, not being married, walked around with a pistol to use on herself, quote, "if the worst happens," end quote. Yet, despite their fears and the situation they found themselves in, it could all have been far worse for the defenders. One of the mysteries of the siege is why the Chinese didn't launch an all-out attack or use their modern Krupp artillery. If they had, the legations would have fallen despite the heroics of the besieged foreigners. The answer lay in the deep divisions that plagued the imperial court and army. The overall commander of the siege, General Zheng Le, allegedly a former lover of the Empress Dowager, was actually the leader of the peace faction and despised the Boxers. He deliberately sabotaged the siege and refused to employ the modern Krupp artillery that could have reduced the legations to rubble in short order. This led to the siege being a weirdly disjointed affair for the Chinese. General Dong's elite Kansu braves, stationed on the west of the legations, were highly committed and did most of the fighting. But the Beijing field army, directly controlled by Zheng Le, often seemed to aim high and was reluctant to attack. General Yuan Shikai, governor of Shantung province and commander of the best-trained division in the whole Chinese army, refused to attack the legations altogether. While this gave the trapped foreigners a lifeline, the resulting siege was still a lethal cat-and-mouse game for them. With the fall of Tientsin, the balance of power once again shifted towards the anti-war faction. The imperial court announced a short-lived truce. The bedraggled defenders were startled to find that the Chinese troops who had been sniping at them the day before were now sending them eggs and even giving tours of their fortifications. Fresh fruit and vegetables and condensed milk arrived from the Forbidden City. Some of the Western ambassadors were even allowed to send telegrams, which is how the outside world came to find out that reports of the legation's demise had been much exaggerated. It was a brief respite, but it gave the defenders some much-needed recovery time. Without it, they would likely have been overrun. But as suddenly as the truce had started, it came to an end. The pro-war faction at court were back in the driving seat, and 5 senior mandarins of the peace party were executed. Some of the hardest fighting of the entire siege awaited the defenders. As the lethal merry-go-round of the imperial court spun on, it was up to the Allied army to finally relieve the siege. Yet there wasn't a great sense of urgency. They were still stuck in Tientsin. The tough resistance they'd encountered taking the city had finally given them a healthy respect for the Chinese army. It wasn't as weak as they had fought, at least on the defensive. As the various nationalities bickered over needing more troops and who would have the honour of leading the way, time slipped by. The logjam was only broken when the British and Americans threatened to go it alone. Horrified that the insolent Anglo-Saxons might hog all the glory, the rest of the army finally agreed to march out. For the first time since the Second Opium War, an army of Westerners were on their way to Beijing. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the final episode of this series, the Allies will fight their way to the gates of Beijing, while those besieged in the legations desperately try to hold on. It was a race against time. The question was, would the Allied army win it? See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.